It started small, a rustling noise at night, a shadow that moved just a bit too quickly out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the normal creaks of an old farmhouse settling into place. The house was ancient, after all, built in the early 1900s, with wooden floors that groaned under the weight of time. The windows were single-paned, drafty, and rattled when the wind blew hard enough. It had been vacant for nearly 10 years before my parents bought it. And I like to joke that it was probably haunted by the ghosts of farmers who'd worked the land. But what started as a joke became something much more sinister. I didn't tell anyone about the feelings I was having, that sense of being watched. It seemed ridiculous. After all, it wasn't like I'd actually seen anything, right? But the feeling was there, a constant, gnawing sensation that someone or something was watching me, especially at night. Then came the dreams. I started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with my heart racing. The dreams were always the same. I'd be standing at the edge of the woods, the trees swaying in the wind, and I'd see him, the man in the mask. He'd be just standing there, motionless, his face hidden behind that awful, expressionless mask. He never moved, never made a sound. But in the dream, I knew he was waiting for something. It was always at the same spot in the woods, just beyond the fence that marked the boundary of our property. I could see it from my bedroom window during the day, an old wooden fence that was falling apart, overtaken by weeds and creeping vines. Beyond it was nothing but thick forest, a stretch of land that went on for miles. One morning, after waking up from the dream for the third time that week, I decided to check the spot. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe to prove to myself that there was nothing there, that the man in the mask was just a figment of my imagination. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way out the back door. The early morning fog was thick, clinging to the ground and curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. The sun had just started to rise, casting long shadows across the yard. As I approached the fence, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was different here, heavier, like the woods were holding their breath. My heart was racing, but I pushed forward, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I reached the spot from my dream, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbance in the dirt. I sighed in relief, turning to head back to the house. But then I saw it. On the fence, etched into the wood with deep, jagged scratches, were two words, "I'm watching." My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, nearly dropping the flashlight. It wasn't possible. No one knew about the dream. No one could have known I'd come to this exact spot. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back inside the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't tell my parents. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. And part of me wondered if maybe I was. Maybe I'd scratched those words into the fence myself, half asleep, trapped in some kind of waking nightmare. But then, a few nights later, I saw him for the first time. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was having trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned for hours before finally giving up. I sat up in bed, staring out the window into the dark yard. That's when I noticed something standing at the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was just a tree or a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw him, the man in the mask. He was standing at the fence, just like in my dreams, completely still, staring up at the house. The moonlight glinted off his mask, highlighting the smooth, featureless surface. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake my parents? Call the police? Run? But I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching him, and he watched me. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked the spot again. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But the scratches on the fence were deeper now. The words more pronounced, "I'm watching." The scratches on the fence were deeper now, and the words, "I'm watching," burned into my mind. The more I stared at them, the more it felt like the house was closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of fear I didn't understand. What started as a sense of unease was now full-blown paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me from the trees. I spent the next few days avoiding the backyard altogether. I didn't tell my parents about what I'd seen. My dad worked late, and my mom was busy trying to make our new house feel like home. They wouldn't believe me. Anyway, how could they? Who would believe that some man in a mask was standing in our yard in the middle of the night, leaving cryptic messages scratched into a fence? But even as I tried to pretend everything was normal, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I walked by a window, I half expected to see him standing there, staring at the house. Every night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my dreams filled with images of that blank, white mask. A week passed before anything else happened. I had almost convinced myself that maybe it had been a one-time thing, a prank, or a bad dream that had gotten out of control. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, one night, it all came crashing back. It was around 2 a.m., and I woke up to the sound of something tapping against my bedroom window. My heart leapt into my throat. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the glass, but the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was like someone was gently knocking, just enough to get my attention. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay under the covers, to hide, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity, or maybe fear, got the best of me. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. He was there. The man in the mask was standing right outside my window, his face inches from the glass. I couldn't see his eyes behind the mask, but I could feel his gaze, cold and piercing. His head was slightly tilted, like he was studying me, waiting for me to react. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place. Paralyzed by fear, my brain raced through 100 thoughts at once. How long had he been there? What did he want? Was he going to break in? And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he lifted his hand and placed it on the window pane, his palm flat against the glass. It left a greasy smudge, a faint outline of his fingers. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his hand pressed against the window, that mask staring back at me, unblinking, and then he stepped back. Without a word, without making a sound, he turned and walked back into the darkness. The moment he disappeared, I bolted out of bed and ran to my parents' room. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy anymore. I needed help. I banged on their door until they woke up. "Someone's outside," I cried, my voice shaking with panic. He was at my window. My dad threw on his robe and rushed outside with a flashlight, while my mom tried to calm me down. She thought it was just another bad dream. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, holding me close. "Your dad will check it out." But I knew it wasn't just a dream. My dad came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. "There's no one out there," he said, his voice gruff. I checked the yard, the woods, everything. No footprints, no signs of anyone. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. He thought I was just being a paranoid kid in a new house. And I couldn't blame him. There were no signs, no evidence. The man was like a ghost, appearing and disappearing without a trace. But I knew what I saw. The next morning, after my parents left for work, I went back to the window. There, in the early light, I could see it, his handprint, smeared against the glass. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there, proof that I wasn't imagining things. I pressed my hand against the glass, comparing the size. His hand had been larger than mine, the fingers long and thin, like a spider crawling over the window. I took a deep breath and stepped back. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even say? They'd think I was crazy too, just like my parents. No one would believe me. But the next night, it happened again. I had barely fallen asleep when I heard it, the same soft tapping on the window. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly turned my head, and there he was. The man in the mask, standing in the exact same spot, his hand resting against the glass. This time, he wasn't alone. There was another figure with him, standing just behind him in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was a woman. She was tall, her body wrapped in what looked like a long, dark coat. Her face was obscured by the night, but she stood perfectly still, just like the man. I felt bile rise in my throat. This wasn't just some prank. This wasn't something I could explain away. Whoever these people were, they were watching me, stalking me. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to my parents' room again. But this time I didn't knock. I barged in, shaking my dad awake. "He's back," I whispered, my voice barely holding it together. "There's someone else with him. I'm not crazy. Dad, please." This time, something in my voice convinced him. He grabbed his shotgun, the one he kept under the bed for emergencies, and stormed outside. I stayed with my mom, listening as he shouted into the night, demanding that whoever was out there show themselves. But there was no answer, just silence. When he came back inside, he looked shaken.
"I didn't see anyone,"
he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. But something doesn't feel right. After that night, my dad installed floodlights around the house, and for a while, things seemed to calm down. I stopped hearing the tapping on my window, and I convinced myself that maybe the lights had scared them off. Maybe they were gone, but deep down, I knew they weren't. For a while, the lights seemed to work. The floodlights cast long, harsh beams that cut through the darkness, illuminating the yard and the edge of the woods. They gave me a sense of security, however false, and I slept a little easier. Weeks passed without incident, and though I remained on edge, constantly scanning the yard for any sign of movement, the man in the mask didn't return. I tried to convince myself that it was over. Maybe my dad's yelling had scared them off, or maybe the lights had made our house too exposed for whatever game they were playing. But deep down, the fear lingered, like a storm brewing on the horizon. And then, one night, everything changed. It was a Saturday. My parents had gone into town for dinner with friends, leaving me alone for the first time in weeks. Normally, they would have insisted I go with them, but I'd made some excuse about homework and stayed behind. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was starting to feel more comfortable in the house, and the lights made me feel safer. I was watching TV in the living room, trying to ignore the occasional creak and groan of the house settling. The wind outside had picked up, making the trees sway and rattle against the windows. I kept glancing toward the sliding glass door that led out to the backyard, half expecting to see something standing in the glow of the floodlights. But the yard remained empty. Around 9 p.m., the power went out. 1 minute, the TV was on. The next, the entire house was plunged into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind howled outside, and the trees cast long, twisted shadows across the walls. The only light came from the dim glow of the moon filtering through the windows. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It was just a power outage. We lived in a rural area. Power outages happened all the time. I took a deep breath and made my way toward the kitchen to find some candles. But as I passed by the sliding glass door, I stopped. The floodlights were off. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The floodlights were solar-powered. They shouldn't have been affected by the power outage. But the yard was pitch black, swallowed by the shadows of the woods. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the yard, right where the woods began. My heart stopped. It was him. The man in the mask. He was back. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were two figures standing with him now. The woman I had seen before, and another figure, taller, broader, standing slightly behind them. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I took a step back, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone, trying to call my dad. But my phone wouldn't unlock. The screen was frozen, stuck on the flashlight. No matter how many times I swiped or tapped, panic surged through me as I glanced back at the window. They were closer now. The man in the mask had stepped into the yard, the soft crunch of grass under his feet barely audible over the sound of the wind. The other two figures followed, moving slowly, deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. My throat tightened, and I felt my knees go weak. They were coming for me. Without thinking, I turned and bolted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I raced toward my bedroom. I slammed the door behind me and shoved my desk in front of it, my mind racing for some kind of plan. I could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. But beneath it, I heard something else. A faint tapping. I turned toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. He was there. The man in the mask was standing outside my bedroom window, his hand pressed against the glass. Just like before, the woman and the other figure stood behind him, their faces hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. My phone was useless. My parents were still out, and the power wasn't coming back on. I was alone. And then the tapping started. At first, it was soft, barely noticeable over the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent, like someone knocking on a door. Except it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the house. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The tapping was coming from downstairs from the front door. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. How could they be at my window and at the front door at the same time? I crept toward the bedroom door, listening. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if someone or something was demanding to be let in. Tap, tap, tap. I leaned against the door, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but there was nowhere to go. The only way out was past them. Then, suddenly, the tapping stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and oppressive. For a moment, I thought maybe they were gone. Maybe they had left. I held my breath, listening, but the only sound was the wind outside. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving up the stairs one step at a time. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, my eyes darting toward the window. He was still there, his hand pressed against the glass, watching me. But the footsteps were inside the house. I grabbed the chair from my desk and held it in front of me like a weapon, my entire body shaking. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused outside my door. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and ragged, as I waited for the inevitable. And then, with a slow creak, the doorknob began to turn. I lunged forward, pushing my weight against the door. But someone was on the other side, pushing back. The door rattled as the figure outside tried to force its way in, the doorknob twisting violently in my hands. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Leave me alone!" For a moment, the pressure on the door stopped. I stood there, panting, my body trembling with adrenaline. And then I heard it, the sound that made my blood run cold. A voice, low, distorted, like it was coming from a broken speaker. "Let us in." I stumbled back, my hands shaking, as the door burst open with a violent crack. The chair flew out of my hands as I fell to the floor, the figure stepping into the room. But it wasn't the man in the mask. It was something else, something much worse. I stared up at the figure that had forced its way into my room, my chest tight with fear, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't the man in the mask. It wasn't even one of the two shadowy figures I had seen outside with him. This thing, standing in my doorway, was different, taller than a person should be. Its body was unnaturally thin and twisted, like its bones had been stretched and broken in all the wrong places. Its skin, if that's what it was a sickly gray, almost translucent, like it had never seen sunlight. It didn't have a face, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface where its features should have been. It stood there, looming over me, its head cocked at an unnatural angle as if it were studying me. And then, without warning, it took a step toward me. I scrambled back, my hands shaking as I fumbled for something, anything I could use to defend myself. But there was nothing. My mind raced, panic taking over as the thing took another slow, deliberate step, its long, twisted fingers twitching at its sides. It didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no breathing, just the low, steady hum of the wind outside, but I could feel its presence. like a crushing weight pressing down on me, filling the room with an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the air. I backed up against the wall, my body trembling, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The window was blocked by the man in the mask, and the door was blocked by this thing. The figure took another step, its head tilting even further, as if it were listening for something, and then it stopped, just a few feet from where I sat, frozen in terror. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as the figure slowly reached out, its long, bony fingers hovering inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to shift. The oppressive weight lifted, just slightly, and I dared to open my eyes. The figure was still there, standing over me, its fingers twitching in the air. But something had changed. It wasn't moving anymore. It was waiting, and that's when I heard it. The voice. "Don't let him in." It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't the distorted, broken voice I had heard before. It was something else, something familiar. And it wasn't coming from the figure in front of me. It was coming from inside my head. I blinked, my mind reeling, trying to understand what was happening. The voice sounded like my own, but it was distant, like an echo. I looked around the room, my breath shaky, trying to find the source, but there was nothing, just the figure, still standing there, perfectly still. And then I saw him, the man in the mask. He was at the window, his hand still pressed against the glass, his blank, white face staring into the room. The woman and the other figure were gone, but he was still there, watching, waiting. I don't know how, but I could feel it, the connection between them. The figure in the room and the man outside. They were linked, somehow. And I knew, deep down, that if I let one of them in, I'd be letting both of them in. "Don't let him in," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. "Don't let him in." My heart raced, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to do. The figure in the room hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of its silence. The man in the mask was still at the window, his hand sliding slowly down the glass, leaving a trail of fog in its wake. I had to make a choice. I grabbed the chair I'd thrown earlier and lunged at the window. My body moved before I had time to think. All I knew was that I couldn't let him in. I couldn't let either of them in. The chair smashed into the window with a deafening crash, shattering the glass. Cold air rushed into the room, and for a moment, I thought I'd made a mistake. The man in the mask didn't move, but his head tilted slightly, as if he were amused by my sudden outburst. But then something strange happened. The figure in the room let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, and stepped back. Its fingers twitched violently, and its body began to contort, its limbs jerking and twisting in unnatural ways. It backed away from me, its head still tilted at that unnatural angle. And then, just like that, it vanished, gone. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I stared at the spot where the figure had been. The room was empty now, save for the broken glass and the cold wind blowing through the window. But the man in the mask was still there. He hadn't moved. He was standing just beyond the broken window, his face expressionless, his eyes, if he even had eyes, locked on me. I could feel him watching me, waiting for me to make a move. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the wind, howling through the trees outside. And then, slowly, deliberately, the man in the mask stepped forward. I backed away, my heart pounding, but he didn't come any closer. He just stood there, at the edge of the broken window, his head tilted slightly as if he were considering something. And then, without a word, he turned and walked into the woods. I stood there, frozen, watching as he disappeared into the darkness. I waited for him to come back, to reappear at the edge of the yard, but he didn't. He was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out into the trees, my body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. The house was silent again, save for the wind rattling the broken window. The figure was gone. The man in the mask was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. I knew, deep down, that he would come back. The next few days were a blur. My parents came home that night to find me sitting in the corner of my room, shaking and unable to explain what had happened. My dad didn't say much when he saw the broken window, just shook his head and called someone to replace the glass. I didn't tell them about the man in the mask. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? It sounded insane, like something out of a bad horror movie. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that it wasn't over. For weeks after that night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept expecting to see him again, to wake up and find him standing at the window, or worse, inside the house. But he never came back. Not in the way I expected, at least. Instead, I started seeing him in other places. Out of the corner of my eye when I was walking home from school. In the reflection of a store window as I passed by. Standing at the edge of the woods when I went for a walk. Always watching, but never getting too close. It was like he was waiting for something. The figure from my room never appeared again. But the nightmares started soon after. I'd wake up in a cold sweat. The memory of that thing's twisted, faceless body burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. I moved out of that house as soon as I could. My parents never understood why I was so eager to leave, but they didn't push me on it. I think they were just relieved that I was getting back to some kind of normal life. I went to college, got a job, tried to move on. But even now, all these years later, I still see him sometimes. The man in the mask, standing in the distance, watching, waiting. And every time I hear that voice in my head, faint but unmistakable, don't let him in.